Welcome back to class. In this session, we're going to look at the major themes in chapters 33 and 34 of Jürgen's The Prize. Our primary focus is to return to the theme of the politics of nationalization. Pick up that story where we left off, basically with the October War in 1973, and follow it through the 1970s into the early 1980s. The big change that we're following, if you recall our discussion of the Nixon Doctrine, right? The U.S. reliance on Saudi Arabia and Iran to operate as proxies for U.S. interests in the region. We want to follow the story of the politics of nationalization to the point where that U.S. policy gets replaced by a new doctrine we're going to call the Carter Doctrine. So we want to watch the transition from the Nixon Doctrine to the Carter Doctrine. Now, it's critical for us to understand in looking at this time period the overwhelming, the kind of pervasive sense of frustration, disappointment, resentment by Arab peoples, not simply against the powers of the West, but increasingly against their own governments. There is a pervasive sense, particularly in the aftermath of the 73 war and the failure of the embargo. The embargo was successful in sort of cratering the Western economies, but the embargo was not successful in compelling the Americans to compel the Israelis to withdraw from these Arab lands that they were occupying. And so there is a pervasive sense of disappointment among Arab peoples with their own governments, and an increasing turn towards organizing paramilitary resistance groups. That is, kind of parallel shadow organizations of, think of these as kind of citizens militias who are coming together, obtaining weapons, training to fight, not just against the Western powers, but as we'll see in this class session, increasingly against their own governments. That what these groups represent is an increasing perception by Arab peoples that their own governments are not trustworthy, they don't actually represent their interests, and so on. So that trend of Arab unity, which is increasing through the 50s and 60s, kind of culminating in the OPEC embargoes. Those two embargoes in 67 and 73 represent the high watermark of Arab unity, but their failure to achieve their goals are now going to set in motion a trend towards Arab conflict. That is, conflict among the different Arab countries, but especially conflict between the peoples of each nation and their own government. Now, this is a tricky subject for us Americans in the 21st century. When we see these organizations and the acts that they carried out, we have a strong impetus to think of this as the origins of modern terrorism. That is, the application of violence or the use of violence to achieve political ends. And in many ways, that's a very reasonable kind of perspective to adopt on these events. But, of course, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Right? And so from the perspective of the Arab peoples, they are simply engaging in asymmetrical warfare, right? Why would you try to take on the American and the Israeli tanks and fighters when that is their strength? And so they start hunting for weaker targets to show their opposition. Surely the most prominent, well-known group of all these paramilitary organizations was known as the Palestine Liberation Organization, and you see the photo there on your screen of Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the PLO. And the PLO is going to carry out a number of violent attacks against Western interests, probably most famously in 1972 during the Olympic Games that were being held in Germany. A kind of squad of PLO fighters infiltrated the security and grabbed a dozen or more Israeli Olympic athletes as hostages, and there was a standoff. It was it was broadcast on international TV. All the television cameras that were there to cover the games were there to cover the hostage situation, and the PLO fighters progressively murdered one Israeli athlete after another until finally the Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad, carried out an assault on the apartments where they were being held, the kind of dormitories where the athletes were being held hostage, and managed to kill the PLO fighters, but also killed nearly all of the Israeli athletes at the same time, and this was a moment of international outrage against the violence being carried out by the PLO. That is probably the most famous attack, but it became almost routine. It's probably too much to say that it was routine, but certainly many, many times, dozens of times, the PLO organization carried out a variety of violent attacks. Probably most famous after the Olympic Games were a series of hijackings of jet planes, right? Civilian airliners carrying civilian peoples. You see the Time magazine cover on the right hand side of your screen. That is a report on one of the most famous of the airline hijackings called the Entebbe hijacking, because they would the hijackers forced the plane to go to Entebbe in East Africa, and they kind of hid out in a friendly country there until the Mossad came and carried out an attack on the plane. So that was very celebrated, but this was happening over and over and over again, certainly dozens of times through the late 70s into the early 80s. PLO type organizations are going to proliferate, and we will have, by the end of the 70s, dozens of different groups, generally with the same goal and tactics as the PLO, but with just sort of obscure names that we've never heard of in the modern media covering of this. The PLO is kind of the emblematic or the iconic organization of all these different organizations. And it is in Lebanon more than anywhere else where these paramilitary organizations are going to proliferate and multiply into sort of dozens and dozens of small militias working very loosely together. If you recall our discussion of the post-World War I settlement, Lebanon was a very unique place in the distribution of Western authority there. If you recall, Syria was under a League of Nations mandate held by the French. Iraq was under a League of Nations mandate headed by the British, and then we had these two areas that were allowed to become their own autonomous countries: Kuwait within the British sphere, and Lebanon within the French sphere. Now, why did the French carve out this separate country, carve it away from the rest of their League of Nations mandate? To understand that, you have to go all the way back to the Middle Ages and the Christian Crusades against the Muslim-held Palestine, and of those waves and waves of kind of European knights that march off to the Holy Land to fight against the Muslims. Many of those were French knights, and a community of kind of the knights that stayed behind, right, after the Crusades were defeated, and there's a kind of Christian community known as the Marianites, which is a French sect of Catholicism, kind of takes hold on this northern shoreline of the modern country of Lebanon. So when the French are given their League of Nations mandate after World War I, they want to create a country for the Christians that live in the region under their mandate control. So if you look at the ethnographic map on the lower right-hand corner of your screen, there's a map of Syria showing where the major ethnic groups reside. And those two pie charts, the one in the upper left-hand corner of that map shows you the distribution of population in 1932 when Lebanon is created, and then the bottom right-hand corner of the screen shows the ethnic distribution in 1985. That is essentially at the conclusion of the Lebanese Civil War. If you look at that first pie chart from 1932, I know it's small and the print's small, but what it shows basically is that the two Christian groups, the Marianites and all other Christians, is how that's divided, make up just more than 50% of the population, something like 52% of the population. Well, that was purposely, the country was purposely created that way so that the Christians would be a majority. And the French wrote a constitution for Lebanon that required that the president always be a Christian. So the French had a notion roughly that the Christian parts of the Lebanese population will always be able to have a president to protect them, while the legislative, the parliament side of the Lebanese constitution there may well be Muslim majorities, but the Christians will always have the executive branch to protect them. And that was sort of the French thinking when they wrote this Constitution. Well, if you look at the pie chart in the lower right-hand side of that map, it shows you how much the ethnic distribution in Lebanon has changed over 50 years. Now the Maronites and the other Christians make up just about 1/4 of the Lebanese population. So now imagine after 50 years, you're living under a constitution that says this 1/4 of the population must win the presidency. The other 3/4 of the population, no matter how many votes they get, how allied their votes are, they are prohibited by the Constitution from ever winning the presidency. And that symbolically, right, it's one critical issue. There are many other issues about the structure of the Lebanese government, breeds resentment, right, breeds opposition among the Muslim population against the Christian population. And that conflict is going to break out into civil war in 1976. If you look at the map on the left-hand side of your screen, it shows two maps, one in 76 and again in 83. We'll come back to that 1983 map in a later class session. But if you focus just on that top map, Lebanon in 1976, you see three groups there, right? That kind of purplish color, those are the Christian militias. If the dark green, now the map calls those Syrian forces. Now that just shows you that this map is kind of pro-Israeli, right? There are Syrian troops in Lebanon, but they're by and large there to support and prop up the Muslim militias, right? So what you really have there in the northern half or 2/3 of Lebanon is the Christian militias against the Muslim militias. And then if you look at the light green at the bottom of the map, those are Palestinian militias. So in this series of Arab-Israeli wars, as Israel wins war after war after war, through the really late 40s with the War of Independence, and then the Suez Crisis, and then the 67 War, and finally the 73 War. After each of those wars, more and more of the Palestinians flee Israel to gain refuge because, of course, the Israeli army is not making it easy for the Palestinians to stay behind and have a kind of normal civilian life. So hundreds of thousands of Palestinians flee north into southern Lebanon, and this is an area where there's sort of dozens of United Nations and Red Cross refugee camps with these poor Palestinians living there. But at the very same time, that's also where the PLO builds their military bases. And very often they're doing it in the very same place. That is to say, the Red Cross will have a refugee camp with thousands of refugees living there, and the PLO will dig tunnels and caves beneath the refugee camp where they'll store their weapons. They'll have bomb-making facilities. They'll go down there to train and plan their operations. So this is a profound dilemma for the Israelis and the West. They want to go in and attack the PLO, but the only way they can do it is by attacking through the civilians, which, if you're at all familiar with the Middle East crisis, will be a familiar kind of scenario for you. So Lebanon, more than any other area of the Middle East, is the place where these militias proliferate and multiply. And it's also the place, because it's in the chaos of a civil war, it's the place where those militias can go and retreat and hide. So they can infiltrate into Israel, they can blow up some buildings, blow up whatever, and then they can run back and hide in southern Lebanon. Now that's going to escalate, and we'll come back to this storyline. In 1982, Israel is going to invade southern Lebanon, but we'll come to that story in just a minute, in just a coming class session. Now there is one kind of moment of peace and optimism here in the 70s. In 1979, Jimmy Carter negotiated a peace accord between Israel and Egypt. And you see the photo there with Jimmy Carter in the middle, and that is Menachem Begin, the Israeli prime minister, and Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian president. Now, this is a great moment of kind of the U.S. playing peace broker in the region. If you recall, it was Sadat who was the leading force in invading Israel in 1973 with the hopes of reclaiming the Sinai Peninsula. When that war fails, the Egyptians enter into negotiation with the Israelis, and kind of the Egyptian advantage here is the Israelis don't really want the Sinai. It doesn't have any particular strategic value to them, unlike the West Bank and the Golan Heights, which they're very much hoping to keep because the kind of topography of those regions make them critical for kind of military strategy. There's no particular value in the Sinai Peninsula, and so in 1979, Begin and Sadat sign a peace treaty, and Egypt becomes the first Arab nation to recognize the state of Israel, to recognize its right to exist, and to start a process of normalizing relations between the two countries in exchange for Israel returning the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And you see in the map there that it's going to be stages of return, right? The dark gray marked as 1975 really marks the beginning of the peace negotiation. So Israel basically gives Egypt back control of both sides of the Suez Canal as a good faith gesture as they're entering into peace negotiations. They're going to give back the big middle chunk of the Sinai in 1979 when the peace accords are signed, and then with the expectation that the remainder of Sinai would be returned to Egypt in 82, which in fact is what happens. So Anwar Sadat becomes the great peacemaker, and if you recall, it was his predecessor, Gamal Nasser, the previous Egyptian president, who was the most ferocious, the most prominent opponent of Israel, right? The leader of the Arab nations against Israel. Well, now Egypt becomes the first peacemaker in the region. And so there is a moment that appears to be, a kind of breakthrough in the relations between Israel and the Arab nations, except just 2 years later, a little over a year later, in 1981, Anwar Sadat is assassinated. As you see the photo there on the lower part of your screen and the New York Times headlines, Sadat and his generals are out reviewing. There's a military parade going on. All the trucks are, driving by, and the soldiers are marching in formation, and they're all politicians and generals and dignitaries in these parade grounds. And this was broadcast on live TV in 1981. Everyone was watching this this ceremony in Egypt, and a group of soldiers leaped out of their trucks and started running towards the viewing grounds, right? The viewing stands, just lobbing hand grenades into the stands and shooting their guns, as you see here in this photo, just kind of blindly spraying automatic fire, and they kill Sadat and dozens of other people. This group that organized this attack is sort of a counterpart to what the PLO is for Palestine, but this is a new group called the Muslim Brotherhood. And we're going to hear much more if you're at all familiar with the story of 9/11, the origins of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and that story that really is a late 1990s story. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is going to be a very important piece of the emergence of Al-Qaeda. Here in 1981, they're a totally obscure organization that, unless you lived in Egypt, you probably haven't heard of the Muslim Brotherhood before. It is a kind of half social services group, right? The Muslim Brotherhood is in the poor neighborhoods of Cairo and Alexandria, and there is much kind of charity organization that brings in teachers to hold school for children, right? Brings in doctors and dentists and whatnot to provide health care for poor people, tries to provide jobs. So it's sort of half a social services doing the things that the Egyptian government is not doing for the poor people of Egypt, but it also has at the very same time this paramilitary, sort of quasi-terrorist wing of the organization. One of the really significant things about the Muslim Brotherhood, as you can see by the title, it is specifically Islamist, right? The identity of the Muslim Brotherhood group is, we are all proud Muslims, we are orthodox, we're pious, and our war against the West is a war on behalf of Islam. Now that's very different if you saw those images of Yasser Arafat and the PLO. Yasser Arafat certainly is a Muslim, but he does not base kind of the righteousness of his cause or his political ideology based on the purity of Islam. Yasser Arafat, more than anything, is a Marxist revolutionary, right? He's a kind of pseudo-communist revolutionary trying to overthrow capitalism and the West. And so we see the emergence of a new kind of Arab identity as the face of resistance to the West. And we're going to see that increasingly through the 1980s. These resistance groups are going to become increasingly Islamist in their orientation. And the Muslim Brotherhood's assassination of Anwar Sadat in 1981 is kind of the wake-up wake-up call to this increasingly religious identity as the foundation of Arab resistance to Israel and the Western powers. And this increasing Islamicism of the resistance fighters is the primary import of another cataclysmic event in the region in 1979, the siege of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Now, this was an event that it didn't involve Israel, right? It didn't particularly involve an attack on Western powers. So this is an event that's pretty obscure in our Western histories and our Western memory of the events in the Middle East in this region. But it was within the region, among Arab peoples, one of the greatest cataclysms of the 20th century. So if you recall our discussion of King Faisal ibn Saud, right, and the Saud family, they base the legitimacy of their rule on being the most orthodox Muslims, right? We are in Saudi Arabia, we are the purest of the pure, the most pious of the pious, and our special responsibility as a government is to protect the ancient holy sites in Mecca and Medina. If you're at all familiar with the early history of Islam, Mecca is the first place that Muhammad, as he's rising as a prophet and being recognized, he asserts his rule over the city of Mecca, and there's an ancient temple in Mecca that becomes called, after the Muslims take over, the Grand Mosque. And at the center of the Grand Mosque, if you look at the image in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, it's just a big cube that here in this photo is covered in black tapestry. That thing is called the Kaaba. And the Kaaba is the most sacred thing in all of Islam. When Muhammad first took over Mecca, this ancient city, there were polytheism pervaded the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. That is, every tribe had its own tribal gods that it worshipped and prayed to. So there was no idea of monotheism before Muhammad comes along, or it wasn't pervasive. And symbolically, when Muhammad took control of Mecca and sort of imposes Islamic rule on the Arabian Peninsula, he requires all of those tribes, they would have little like statues that represented their tribal gods, right? And you'd carry those around with you as kind of holy relics. Well, he required each of the kind of chiefs of the tribe or the leaders of the tribe to place the statue of their tribal god inside of this cube. So if you pulled the tapestry away, what would you have is kind of cubby holes, if you will. Now it's rare black onyx stone. It's beautiful and rare and precious stone that this giant cube is made out of, but it's essentially got dozens, maybe scores of little cubby holes in the face of it. And symbolically then each tribe had to put the statue of their particular tribal god in one of these cubby holes. And symbolically what they're doing is they're submitting their own tribal gods to the one God, the true God, the overarching supervising God that Muhammad was preaching about, right? So you see symbolically in the Kaaba the transition from polytheism to monotheism. And so this big stone is basically what it is. Big stone cube is the most sacred thing in the religion of Islam. So if you have any Muslim friends, you may be aware, if you're at all studied anything about Islam, every Muslim, one of their religious obligations is once during their lifetime, if you can afford it, to travel to Mecca and to visit the Grand Mosque. And there's a ritual of walking in circles around the Kaaba. And this is known as the Hajj, or the pilgrimage. And if you have Muslim friends, you probably have talked to them about their trip to the Holy Land. Every Muslim, again, if you can afford it, and there are charities around to help you pay for it if you can't afford it, but once in your lifetime, you're supposed to travel to Mecca, and it's really beautiful. If you've ever seen videos of it, they walk, you're supposed to circle the Kaaba 7 times, but in opposite direction with each pass. So if you see a kind of overhead aerial photo of the Kaaba during the Hajj, you'll see this just as in these photos, easily hundreds of thousands, I don't know, maybe 1 million people can pack into this mosque, but they walk in opposite circles, just packed shoulder to shoulder tight inside around the Kaaba, but you'll see 7 circles, each moving in a clockwise, counterclockwise, clockwise, counterclockwise for 7 concentric rings. And it's really a beautiful image to see. It's, the peace and the cooperation among these people from all over the world and coming in and paying their religious tribute. So the Grand Mosque and the Kaaba are the most sacred thing in Islam. And in November 1979, a paramilitary group, you see the photo at the bottom center of your screen of Jahaman al-Utabi, is sort of the leader. And the way to think about these guys is not so much a paramilitary organization, but a kind of religious cult within Islam. That is to say, this guy Jahaman had a vision of the second coming, what in Islamic terms they call the Mahdi is returning, which is essentially a kind of story not that different than the Christian story of, God's disciple returning to earth to deliver justice and the final judgment. So this guy Jahaman had a vision and had a couple hundred followers, and their vision was the Mahdi was coming and they had to destroy the corruption of Islam in the present world. So they've got guns and hand grenades, and they enter into the mosque and they just start throwing hand grenades and shooting people. As people flee and there is chaos, they hide in the mosque. Now this, of course, the Grand Mosque is over 1,000 years old, and there are layers upon layers upon layers underneath that have been dug out caves and tunnels beneath the structure that we see on the surface. So his followers went down and hid in those caves with their guns and ammunition and their hand grenades, and it took weeks for the Saudi Arabian police to search out, root out, going cave by cave. There's multiple layers underneath the mosque, and it took them weeks. And you see that image on the left-hand side of your screen of the smoke billowing up from the Grand Mosque. Now this is a great embarrassment, humiliation to the Saudi government, right? Their primary function as a government is to protect the holy sites of Islam, and they have permitted this terrorist group, this paramilitary group, this cult, to come in and slaughter innocent people praying before the Kaaba. And we're so weak as a government that it took them weeks and weeks and weeks to solve the problem. They didn't have enough military forces or police forces to quickly impose order. And the reason this is so significant, besides the kind of great public embarrassment to the Saudi government, is once again, just like with the Muslim Brotherhood, we see a form of resistance and opposition to these Arab governments that's not coming from a place of kind of Marxism, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, but instead it's coming from a place of intense religious devotion. Right? Saudi Arabia is the most Islamic place, or it thinks of itself at least as the most Islamic country. And here is a cult and its followers attacking the Saudi government because they're accusing it of being apostate, of being heretical, right? Of allowing Islam to get corrupted. And so this is a direct line to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's central complaint against the Saudi Arabian government is they have sold out Islam. They have gotten into the back pocket of the Western powers. They're no longer pure. And you see that photo in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. That is Mohammed bin Salman. That is the original king of Saudi Arabia. And then his closest advisor, this guy named Ibn Abda al-Wahhab. And that al-Wahhab is sort of a spiritual advisor, a religious leader that is going to give a namesake to a whole kind of strain of Islamicism we call Wahhabism. Right? And you want to think of Wahhabism as kind of ultra-orthodox, ultra-fundamentalist, ultra-literalist version of Islam. Wahhabism is the official denomination of the Saudi Arabian, we might call it a Saudi Arabian church, right? The official state Islamic church in Saudi Arabia is officially Wahhabist. When Osama bin Laden and the other al-Qaeda fighters emerge in the 1990s, they are going to claim themselves as the only pure Wahhabis. They're the only ones that really understand the teachings of Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, and it was the Saud family that have become corrupted and allowing the Wahhabi teachings to get watered down to permit cooperation with the West. So this Grand Mosque siege, even though it was not well publicized in the West, and it's not an event that plays a large role in our narrative, in our Western narrative of events in the Middle East. It is profound in showing it's a kind of, you can see the tectonic plate shifting in the nature of Arab resistance, and this is a kind of foretelling of, or a foreordaining of, the direction that Arab resistance is going to take in the coming decades. And certainly by far the biggest, most consequential event of these years of the late 70s, and the one that Jürgen spends the most time on, is the Iranian Revolution, which begins in January of 1979. Now, we've been following the Shah all the way along since the post-World War II settlement. The Shah is going to become increasingly unpopular among the Iranian people, and increasingly authoritarian as his grip on power becomes more tenuous. The Shah is really divided between two groups in Iran, and he can't satisfy both of them. There are kind of the traditional great landowners going all the way back to the pre-modern period, right? The huge landowners that have lots of peasants working on their land, and they expect a lot of influence with the Shah. But there are also the religious leaders, the Ayatollahs, and they expect deference from the Shah, particularly as the Shah becomes more westernized, right? As the Shah permits more kind of Western goods, Western products, Western movies, Western fashions to come into Iran, he increasingly alienates the clerical leaders, if you will. And he's going to kind of, these two stones are going to spread, and he's got 1 foot on each stone, and it's just going to, they're going to spread wider and wider apart, the conflict between these two forces in Iran, and the Shah's not going to be able to sort of manage to mediate and maintain his control. All the while, as his rule is being challenged through, really from 73 on, the United States is going to provide more and more military aid and training to the Shah that the Shah is going to use not to go out and carry out foreign policy against other countries, but he's going to take this American weaponry and American training and apply it against his own people. That is, by 76, 77, 78, Iran really has become a police state where people can get picked up and disappeared into prisons and tortured without any trace. It is increasingly becoming a kind of North Korea style dictatorship by the late 70s. Now, the character, the guy who's going to emerge as the leader of the Iranian Revolution, you see his picture there on the upper left-hand side, Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. That title, Grand Ayatollah, simply means great teacher. So it's a kind of rank among the learned clerics. So you can think of this as full professor or professor emeritus of Islamic studies. Right? It's the highest title of teacher. But it's really important to understand, because this is Shia Islam, there is nothing holy or sacred about this guy Khomeini. That is to say, he's not like, say, Jesus or something. He's not sort of half God, half man or anything like that. He's simply a wise elder teacher. And if you think of kind of a, the clerical establishment of Iran is kind of like a university faculty, he would be the senior most faculty, the highest ranked professor in the university. That's where that title, Grand Ayatollah, comes from. So the Khomeini is preaching from his mosque against the Shah all through the mid-70s about his corruption, about his westernization, how he is taking away Iran's Islamic values and the Islamic foundation of Iranian society. And ultimately, the Shah is going to exile Khomeini. He's going to tell him, you have to leave the country. He's going to go first to Iraq, and actually when he gets to Iraq, the Shah is going to make a secret communication to Saddam Hussein and say, would you kindly kill this guy for me? Right? I've sent him into exile. I can't be accused of his murder because that'll cause a revolt and riot in Iran. But boy, it would be great if this guy just disappeared. But for a variety of reasons, Saddam Hussein does not comply, does not follow the Shah's suggestion, and ultimately Khomeini is going to end up in France, just outside of Paris. And for years leading up to the January Revolution, Khomeini is going to be basically sitting in his Paris apartment recording sermons on cassette tapes, right? Basically preaching against the Shah. Those cassette tapes are going to get smuggled into Iran, duplicated and copied and spread around and transcribed, right, into written form and handed out as leaflets. So Khomeini becomes the voice of the revolution, the voice of resistance against the Shah, even as he's living in exile. The opposition to the Shah is going to grow and grow, and has primarily expressed itself in strikes. That is, workers refusing to go in and work and do their jobs, and absolutely massive public protests, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people coming out on the national strike days, occupying the center squares of towns and cities all throughout Iran, and that instability, that shutting down of the Iranian economy, is ultimately going to force the Shah to flee in January 1979. He's going to board a plane saying he's got to have, I think it was his kidney or maybe it was his liver or something wrong. He's got to go to the United States for medical treatment. Everybody knows when he's boarding the plane, he's fleeing the country, but he's going to come to the United States. And at the moment that he flees, just a couple of weeks later, Khomeini's going to show up on a plane from Paris and lead the revolution against the Shah's government. And that revolution is ultimately going to produce the Iranian hostage crisis. So you have to imagine a kind of chaotic environment where Khomeini is kind of the spiritual leader, the figurehead of the revolution, but there are many different groups. Not all of them are Islamists. Not all of them are intensely religious in the same way. There's sort of the students, secular kind of students. There's the great landowners. There's the military establishment. There's lots of different groups that are participating in the revolution, and Khomeini does not directly control them. He's not like the general commander of revolutionary forces. There's just sort of chaos in the country, and Khomeini is the figurehead. Well, among these different groups, as I just mentioned, the university students were sort of their own kind of faction in the revolution, very radical, extremely hostile to the Shah and the West, and a group of university students are going to climb over the U.S. embassy walls in Tehran, and they're going to seize the U.S. embassy and take hostage 54 sort of staff members. There's a few soldiers in there trying to guard, but it's a lot of like CIA officers, State Department people are in the U.S. Embassy. Now here you may not understand or have a background to appreciate a foreign embassy is the territory of the country that embassy represents. So if you go to Washington, D.C., the Russians, the Chinese, the Brits, the French, every country in the world has an embassy in Washington, D.C. Well, the land that the Russian embassy is built on is considered the territory of Russia. Right next door to it might be, say, the Chinese embassy. Well, the land that Chinese embassy is built on is considered the land and territory of China. And this is just a diplomatic etiquette that goes back hundreds of years. If you want to have an ambassador come and stay in your country from another country, you have to confer the dignity of giving them a patch of land to call their own. And this is just kind of diplomatic protocol going back hundreds of years. So in terms of the hostage crisis, what we have to understand is when those students climb over those gates and that wrought iron fence and take hold of the embassy, legally, politically, that's just like they attacked Washington, D.C., or they attacked Detroit or any other patch of land within the United States. That is an assault, a military assault on the sovereign dignity of the United States. Now they're going to hold these hostages. They're going to disperse them throughout the country. And Jimmy Carter is going to try mightily for over a year to negotiate the hostages' release and even organize a rescue mission. You see the photo in the middle bottom of your screen of the crashed helicopter. There's a kind of secret ops, special ops mission to try to go in with a handful of helicopters and the SEALs or whatever our special forces were that were on the helicopter, and they get caught in a dust storm in the middle of the desert in Iran. It chews up the motor of the helicopter. Several of the helicopters crash and the whole mission is a failure. So the national humiliation of the Iranian hostage crisis, right? Here's this ragamuffin nobody, this guy Khomeini, and even worse, just these college students have brought the United States to its knees, have rendered the United States powerless to affect the release of the hostages. Now, the students and the kind of revolutionary leaders who are in control of the hostages, they're goal comes long after the kind of terms of the release, and basically what they want is the release. The United States has frozen Iranian funds that are being held in American banks because the Shah was overthrown. They're going to freeze all that money, and essentially the Iranians want that money released, and more than anything, they want the Shah returned to them. Right? You Americans put the Shah on a plane and ship him back to Tehran because we want to put him on trial and execute him for crimes against the nation. Well, they're never going to get the Shah back. They're going to get a significant portion of their funds thawed out and get access to them again. But the Iranians are going to refuse. They're so committed to humiliating Jimmy Carter that they're going to refuse to release the hostages to Carter, even though basically the terms of the release have been worked out. And on the day that Ronald Reagan is inaugurated into office, all the hostages are sitting on an airplane in a Tehran airport waiting to take off. Everybody's watching Reagan's inauguration on TV, and the moment that Reagan concludes his oath of office, right, he swears to protect and defend the Constitution, the minute he finishes his oath, the hostages are permitted to take off and return to the United States, so that Reagan gets the credit for freeing the hostages, which Jimmy Carter was not able to do. But you really have to understand here the sense of humiliation and shame to the United States. We're just a few years after the end of Vietnam, where we basically had our tails kicked and had to flee Vietnam with our tail between our legs. And just a few years later, these Iranian kind of street thugs and street gangs are able to bring the greatest military superpower on the planet to their knees, begging for the release of their hostages. Finally, then, to kind of round out this very terrible year of 1979, in December, on Christmas Eve of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And they had been mucking around in Afghanistan for years and years and years, kind of prop up a puppet government that was going to be, sort of in the back pocket of the Soviet influence. And because they were having so much trouble kind of creating a friendly government, the Soviet Union just decides to invade Afghanistan outright. Now, if you look at the map in the lower left-hand side of your screen, and if you find Afghanistan there, look just to the left, there's Iran. So we just had at the beginning of 1979, Iran, which had been the United States' closest ally in the region. Remember the Nixon doctrine, Iran was the most important partner. That has just fallen out of U.S. alliance with the revolution. And just 11 months later, the Soviet Union is invading Afghanistan, a neighboring country and a clear threat to Pakistan and India, which are all, whether officially in the non-aligned movement, but really are much closer to the United States and the West than they are to the Soviet Union in this time period. So the Soviets coming into Afghanistan appears to the Americans to kind of round out this collapse of the Near East, right? This moving away of the Near East from the Western sphere into the Soviet sphere. Now, the Soviets, and we'll come back to this theme in a later class session, the Soviets are going to spend 10 years in Afghanistan. They're going to suffer tens of thousands, nearly 100,000 casualties in Afghanistan, and the Soviets are going to have an experience in Afghanistan that's not that different than the United States experience in Vietnam. And the United States is going to send in sort of CIA and other secret ops to support the Afghans in their resistance. We'll come back to this theme, but at the moment in December 1979 when this occurs, it appears to be yet one more domino falling, right? And the American resistance to the Soviet Union and the Soviet allies, that whole network that we've been building up for some 40 years since the end of World War II, or 35 years since the end of World War II, seems to be falling apart here in 1979. And so it is in direct response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that Jimmy Carter announces what will come to be called the Carter Doctrine. And this is from his State of the Union address in January of 1980. And that's the second paragraph that's particularly important. Carter said, "Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interest of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force." And so notice the escalation from the Nixon doctrine, which is really, Nixon never gives one great speech that we can pull a paragraph out of and say, this is the Nixon doctrine, but it's in a response to the 1967 war and the attempt by the OPEC countries to embargo the Western countries. So 68, 69, 70, Nixon is raising up Saudi Arabia and Iran to operate as our proxies in the region, right? These are our closest allies. Don't mess with us or you'll have to deal with Iran, essentially the message of the Nixon doctrine. So notice the escalation here in the Carter doctrine. Essentially what the Carter doctrine says is we are no longer going to rely on our proxies. Anybody messes with the United States and you will hear about direct U.S. military intervention, right? No longer working through our proxies, we will commit American forces to resisting any aggression against us, and especially any attempt to cut off the oil supplies from the Persian Gulf. Now, Jimmy Carter gives this speech in January of 1980. He's about to lose the 1980 election, so it's not especially under Jimmy Carter that the Carter Doctrine gets implemented. It's going to be under Ronald Reagan that the Carter Doctrine gets implemented. Carter announces this doctrine at the very end of his term. Essentially, he doesn't know it at this point, at the point he says it. But what essentially is going to be the end of his term, and then it's going to be left to Reagan, who has a very different attitude about the Cold War and being strong against the communists and everything. So Carter, the Democrat, the liberal, provides the ideological justification for Reagan, the hard-nosed anti-communist Cold War fighter, essentially gives him the justification to carry out direct military intervention by the American troops. And we'll turn to that in 2 more class sessions. We'll come back and look at the escalation. Once the Carter Doctrine is announced here in 1980, there's going to be a series of escalatory steps that the United States is going to take that will ultimately lead to the first Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War in 1991. We want to see the steps from the Nixon Doctrine in the late 60s, around 1970, the evolution to the Carter Doctrine here in 1980, and then the escalation of the Carter Doctrine until we get massive U.S. military intervention in the Persian Gulf. We're going to have over 300,000 American troops in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait in 1991 and 1992, and that is the full evolution of the American policy in the Middle East. Before we can get to that, though, in the next class session, we need to turn to the economic fallout from the oil shocks of the 1970s and the restructuring of the oil market and the stock market around it in the 1980s and the 1990s, and we'll turn to that in our next class session.